Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, and business. This week, authors Donald Miller and Richard Sharpless discuss their book, The Kingdom of Coal, Work, Enterprise, and Ethnic Communities in the Minefields.
Donald Miller, author of The Kingdom of Coal. In reading this book, it occurred to me that there are so many different aspects to the history of coal that we could probably do an hour on each chapter of your book. And since we only have an hour to talk about it, what's the thing we should not miss talking about?
Well, it's a large story. It's a Pennsylvania story, but it's an American story. And we're trying to tell the story of the greatest social transformation that this country has ever experienced, the Industrial Revolution. And that Industrial Revolution began in northeastern Pennsylvania with the discovery and utilization of anthracite coal. And so this is an epic story that brings into play the early transportation systems by which they haul the coal out of the region, the creation of the first giant companies in the area, Irish immigration to the area, the rise of labor unions and the Molly Maguires, and it takes the story all the way down to the peak and then decline of the anthracite industry. They almost occur simultaneously, by the way. Anthracite kind of peaks around World War I and then experiences a very precipitous decline after that. So you have in microcosm here the history of the American Industrial Revolution close in right here in Pennsylvania. Whereas usually a lot of historians are arguing that industrialization begins with the big water mills at Lowell, Massachusetts, and that's where it kind of gets started. But I don't think you have industrialization until you have iron, and you don't have iron until you have coal. And those two, iron and coal, are the materials that really make for industrialization, and they come together first in the United States, at least in northeastern Pennsylvania.
Richard Sharpless,
I'd like to add,
go ahead.
it's also a story, too, of the people who made this particular industry and, in fact, who made up this culture. There were, first of all, the Scots-Irish and Germans who were in the region first, and they were followed by the Irish, and then after the Civil War by many nationalities from Eastern and Southern Europe. And they developed unique cultures, their own, and in the process, of course, they built solid communities, built usually around their parishes, their churches, and developed the unique ethnic mix that really is Pennsylvania. And so what you see throughout Pennsylvania, especially in industrial areas like Pittsburgh, really got its start in the anthracite region, too.
You first wrote this book in 1985.
We wrote it, yes. It was first published in late 85, I think early 1986. That's correct.
And it's just been republished by Canal Press?
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything different about it?
No, we did not change literally anything. The book is just as it was originally published. We didn't feel that there was, that even over the period of from 1986 to now, there was really that much to add change in the story. It was, we felt it is a comprehensive history. It's the first comprehensive history of the region and the culture. And so we had a very good reception of the book when it first came out, and we've been pleased with it. So it's been republished as it was.
Now, both of you teach at Lafayette College.
Exactly.
In eastern Pennsylvania.
Yes.
You use this book as a text?
We have. We built an entire program around the course, a regional studies program. In fact, the program preceded the course. We were looking around for a book to use, and the idea of the program was that you can't study something as large and complex as American industrialization on a national scale and make much sense out of it. So we came around to the idea that the way to study this is regionally. Richard had done a lot of work on regional studies in Latin America, for example, and I'd been doing some regional studies work on New York City, and so we thought this was an ideal way to do it, where you study the ecology, the land, the geography, and how it shapes people, and people in turn shape the geography, this dialectical relationship between man and the environment. So that's the kind of program we were building, and we were looking around for a book to use and found there was none. So we were sitting around a tavern one night having a few beers, and we decided We'll write one.
That's right. It also helped the fact that we both have roots in the anthracite region. My family originally came from the Wilkes-Barre area, and Don's family lived in the Port Clinton area, the southern Schuylkill coal fields, that area down there. And so we had personal sentiments and feelings about the region. And for me personally, I always wanted to write a book about the coal region from the time I was in high school, I think. Because I've always been fascinated by this particular part of Pennsylvania, which seemed so different from other parts. You know, back when I was growing up in the 50s, for example, you always were happy to meet somebody from the coal region, and you didn't have to identify in any other way but coal region. And the people seemed to be more friendly, and it just gave me at least a good feeling. And so. I think that those facts helped us too when we set out to do the research for the book.
How'd you write it?
It's a true cooperative effort. Don did the original research, and then we go over what he thought was vital for the particular chapters. I would go ahead and write a draft, and then he would take it and do revisions and rewriting, and then we would sit down and go over it again, and then do a final draft on it. It was quite an experience, by the way.
We didn't block it out, in other words, and say, like, you take half the book, I'll take half the book. So our thumbprints on every, our individual thumbprints are on every chapter. We wanted to get that sense of continuity, that you're not reading two different authors, you know. So we try to meld it together as best we could. But
Who are some of your favorite characters who you came across in writing this? Either people you interviewed or people you studied?
one of the guys Bill Wine is a great character for us, because Bill Wine, who recently died, was for 45 years an anthracite miner, and he lives up in the New Philadelphia area. Lived up in the New Philadelphia area, and we came across him in a little bar room up in the coal regions early on in our research, and we wanted someone that we could talk to who was actually a skilled anthracite miner who could take us in a mine and show us how the work was done. We wanted to get that sense, I guess what you'd call it, use the pompous word verisimilitude, feel for the situation. We really wanted to know what it was like to mine coal, and he was great. He put the helmets on us and took us underground and the picks and shovels and showed us how it was done and the dynamiting and things like that. And we really got a sense and feel for it. And whenever we ran into a tough question, and whenever we were, especially in the chapter where we talk about the mining process, how, and it is the most dangerous work in the world. I mean, how it's done, and we wanted to convey that and do it with a lot of accuracy. When we run into a problem, we'd call Bill. We'd go up to see him, and he was an absolutely memorable character.
He was very patient with us. I think another character too, one I particularly like, was Steve Nelson. Steve was originally from what is today, or used to be, I guess, Yugoslavia, and he was an organizer for the Communist Party back in the 1930s. First out in Detroit, he took part in the great strikes of that era there, and later he was assigned to the anthracite region and became a major organizer for the Communist Party in the anthracite region. And he was a wonderful man, tremendous humanity, great sentiments, great feelings. And he introduced us to people. He was also the political commissar of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade during the Spanish Civil War. But he was a man who had great stories to tell about his days in the anthracite region. And until he died, he had a great love for the people of anthracite. He always called it the anthracite.
The anthracite.
Preceded it with a "the."
Yeah. He'd come over to Lafayette and many times and speak to our students, and he had more life at 89 than any of them did. He was just terrific.
You two went into working coal mines?
Yes, we
Sure,
did.
To research?
Yes, we did.
What was it like?
Dark and dangerous. It has that feeling, I mean, the walls dripping with water. There's lighting in there now, of course, because they're not doing any mining. There's electrical lighting in there. But Bill would take us in and he'd turn all the lights out and put the mining, caps on. He said, "Turn these things out."
Where was this mine?
Ashland. He took us to some other mines around there. And we also went over to Pottsville, and there's some working mines in the Pottsville area where they were actually doing some dynamiting when we were over there. And so we really wanted to get that real authentic feel for the situation. And we both have relatives that have been in coal mines and things like this. My wife's grandfather was a miner for 51 years and was badly hurt, badly burned, over 9/10 of his body in a terrible mine fire. My relatives were all miners and railroad workers in the Pottsville, Jim Thorpe area. So, we've had some experience there.
I actually went in the mines when I was fairly young because we lived about a block in Wilkes-Barre, about a block and a half from a mine, a drift mine. And in fact, one of my earliest memories, it happened during World War II, was of a mine accident. And I remember a very cold November day, standing around the colliery with the people who were waiting to get word on their loved ones who were down below. And there was the ambulance there, and it was a very solemn, very sad, time, and it made a tremendous impression on me. Seeing these adults that I knew very well, very stoically waiting for this word on what was happening down below. So, we did have personal experience, which we, tried to then translate into the book.
And we were surprised that there was no one had written the big story, because it's a sprawling story. It's a wonderful story and has all the components of great drama in it. And there was no one single book that brought it all together.
Donald Miller, where did you grow up?
Reading, Pennsylvania. My father was born in a little town about 30 miles up from Reading, Port Clinton, which is right at the edge of the coal regions, and my mother was born in Reading. One's of German instinct, and the other is of my mother is is Slovak, and primarily my father is Irish and German. Yeah.
Where'd you go to school?
Went to school in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Bishop McDevitt High School, and then went to college out in western Pennsylvania to St. Vincent's College. You might not know it, the Princeton of the Alleghenies. Little Benedictine school out there, and then on to graduate school at the University of Maryland.
Studying?
I studied history, yeah. Was a major in philosophy as an undergraduate, and then went on to history later on, yeah. But had no interest in this sort of thing when I was in college. Yeah.
What do you teach now?
I teach, I guess you could call me professor of things in general. I teach a myriad of things, and I have a research chair, and I'm teaching mostly things. I am fortunate in this regard. I'm teaching mostly things that I'm working on. I do a lot of television work, and I do a lot of writing, so I'm doing courses that are directly related to what I'm writing about and teaching about. For example, we had the wonderful ability to combine the teaching of this book with the writing of the book, and that helped it along. But right now I'm doing a book on the Civil War on Vicksburg, and I'm doing a big book on New York City in the 1920s and 30s. So those are the courses that I teach.
Richard Sharpless, you said you grew up in Wilkes-Barre?
Part of the time I grew up in Wilkes-Barre. I came from a sort of schizophrenic family, the region. My father's family, descendants of Quakers, and they were Protestant, middle-class professionals. My mother's family came from Lithuania. They were immigrant, Catholic, working class, started out a miner. My grandfather learned mining in South Africa, learned diamond mining in South Africa, and then came to the United States and took up mining here. He was injured and then opened a saloon, as all good Lithuanians, I guess, do eventually.
Where was that?
In Wilkes-Barre. And so I grew up, especially in World War II. My father was away. My mother was working in defense plants, and I spent most of my time growing up in Wilkes-Barre, and would sort of go back and forth between these two families. Saturday night was the raucous, ethnic, beer-loving Lithuanian family, and Sunday was always the very proper roast beef dinner at the Sharplesses. So,
what was your Lithuanian family name?
Šergalis. chrysalis. It was actually, that was the Americanization of the name. I think some immigration official probably couldn't spell Sargalis, so they changed it to chrysalis at Ellis Island. So it was, it was a very, it was an interesting way to grow up, because I got two sides of this, so to speak. My uncle, for example, was an attorney for mine companies, coal mining companies, while some of my other relatives, one uncle in particular, was an organizer for the United Mine Workers. So you know, I did get both sides of the story, so to speak, while I was growing up there.
Your schooling?
I went to Elizabethtown College, actually, and then to Penn, and eventually got a PhD from Rutgers University.
How'd you find your way to Lafayette?
Well, interestingly enough, my original interest was Latin America, as Don mentioned earlier. And but while I was studying Latin America and writing about it, I began to see that the process of industrialization and economic development generally that occurred in places like the Sugar Islands of the Caribbean was repeated in a way in our own industrial areas. And so I began to look at the United States, especially the areas around Wilkes-Barre and Scranton, that had gone through this process of economic development, and then when the national economy moved on, went into this period of decline, just as, say, sugar did, for example, in the West Indies in the 19th century. And so I came back then, almost full circle, so to speak, back to studying about industrialization here.
That's something a lot of people don't appreciate in Pennsylvania. You know, I mean, you're never appreciated in your own home, your own state, but you don't appreciate your own home and your own state until you get away. We were both watching, well, at separate times, actually. I was teaching at Oxford University in England, and I was team teaching a course with a colleague at Oxford on the Industrial Revolution, and he said he had some interesting film material to show me. And it was a film on the on the Industrial Revolution worldwide. It started with Britain and the Severn River Valley and the original production of iron in that valley, and said this is the center of the 18th century Industrial Revolution right here in the valley. And then the next scene begins in Easton, Pennsylvania. There's a guy standing there. I said, I know that place. I live there.
Yeah, we live right here.
And he said, follow this. This is Easton, Pennsylvania. Follow this river, the Lehigh River, up beyond Allentown, Bethlehem, into the anthracite region. And this is the center of the American Industrial Revolution. And for the next hour, that was it. And I said,
it was a kind of light went on.
yeah,
you know, all of a sudden,
the light goes on. You know, you say, this isn't a local story.
Yeah,
This is an international story. In fact, a Society for Industrial Archaeology, which goes all over the world studying the archaeology of industrialization, the first tour they did was, of course, in Manchester, England, which is really the seat and center of the early industrialization. But the second tour was of the Pennsylvania anthracite region. So they had something like 300 industrial archaeologists from all over the world descend on northeastern Pennsylvania to try to take a look at it and study it and see what was.
You know, we sort of assumed that you know, that the industrialization had occurred in New England, as we've read and been told and everything, and so it was somewhat of a surprise, I guess, to us that the English at least seemed to think that that's not the story, that the story really occurred here in northeastern Pennsylvania, and then we began to look at this a little more closely, and it made sense. Yeah. There was an historian, I believe it was at Harvard, Alfred Chandler, who had written an article making the same point, arguing that the Industrial Revolution was really not indigenous to New England, that the Industrial Revolution began in Pennsylvania. And the reason is because of this energy source. In New England, there was water power, but that was very limited and could not sustain economic development of the kind that could be sustained by, say, iron based on coal. And so, using that logic, he came to the conclusion that it was, in fact, here in northeastern Pennsylvania that the Industrial Revolution really began. I might note that in publications put out by the Commonwealth, they argue that point. Now, this is where the Industrial Revolution began. I've noticed that.
For people who are from other parts of the state and might not know, when you talk about the anthracite region, where exactly are you talking about?
Well, it's an area, the best way to think about it is Route 22. You're driving Route 22 across the state, and you come to Hamburg, Pennsylvania, and you just head north up through Hamburg and into Port Clinton and through the Gap and into Pottsville, and follow that line west all the way up to just north of Wilkes-Barre. And that corner of Pennsylvania, that northeastern corner of Pennsylvania, is where you have over 85 to perhaps 90% of the deposits of anthracite in the world are located in that region.
We like to say it's sort of between the Susquehanna River on the west and north and the Lehigh River and the Schuylkill River. They flow sort of southeast. And it's the coal fields actually extend into the northern part of Dauphin County, and then as far north as just north of Scranton in Port Carbon, that area there. And they're not connected. There are three major fields. But as Don said, there's about 75% of all the world's anthracite, hard coal, is located there.
What's so special about anthracite?
It has a very high carbon content. It burns intensely, and it's smokeless. It doesn't pollute.
Something I learned.
Yes, it makes an ideal fuel for cooking and for home heating and for urban use because of its low pollution factor.
Something I learned from your book, you quote someone as saying that they had a hard time getting anthracite to burn.
Yeah,
That's right.
In the beginning,
That's right.
and it occurred to me that they didn't know
And how to do it.
how to use it. And you have one person saying, if the world should take fire, the Lehigh coal mine would be the safest retreat, the last place to burn.
Right.
An early experimenter in
Right.
anthracite.
Because they couldn't get it to burn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could get a small piece of anthracite and put a lighter under it for an entire day, and you're not going to get that thing to ignite. So it has that tightness to it. So bituminous is very loose, and it throws a lot of pollutants into the air. Consequently, a place like, say, Pittsburgh, where the home heating was done with bituminous. Of course, Pittsburgh had other problems with the mills and things like that. Was a much dirtier place than the air was far more polluted and dirtier than Philadelphia, which used clean burning anthracite. You know?
What is it about the Northeast that caused anthracite to form there? What's it made out of?
There was millions of years ago. The middle part of the continent was a vast lake, and periodically the movement of this water would flow into that area. And all of the vegetation, the remains of animals would gradually be pressed down into the surface of the earth, and over eons of time, as a result of this tremendous pressure, there would be various kinds of what we call coal today forming. But in the anthracite, in the Appalachians, there was a massive upheaval for whatever reason, I don't know, and the tremendous pressure caused by this upheaval hardened this coal to make anthracite. Whereas, for example, out in the Pittsburgh area, in the western part of Pennsylvania, you have bituminous, and that's soft coal, really, and it lies in beds that are relatively horizontal or level. But in anthracite, because of this upheaval from the earth and because of the pressure, it is the coal seams that shoot up at sharp angles and are under much more intense pressure, and that gave it the content that we call anthracite, hard coal, the high carbon.
Makes it hard to get at, makes it dangerous to mine also. Yeah.
How'd the industry get started?
Well, it got started with pick and shovel capitalists, kind of like the gold rush in California. And,
You refer to the
It was
coal
really
rush.
it was the first energy crisis in the country, really, that brought it on. It was during the War of 1812 with the British blockade, and the fact that big cities like Philadelphia were very dependent on charcoal and on wood. But you know, by the early 19th century, the forests were receding as a result of the cutting and what have you, and getting wood was becoming more and more expensive. Coal had been used; it had been brought in from Britain on ships as ballast. So coal had been used, but not in the great quantities that were necessary. So really, it was that crisis that gave a boost to the use of anthracite. And from there, of course, after the technology was developed that showed it could be burned readily in hearths and in stoves, and it could be used for industrial processes, it literally took off because it was the first American energy source, really.
And it's a prototypical American industry in the sense that you get the small guys in there first, the explorers and the early entrepreneurs. And as Dick says, once this thing gets triggered, the big money comes in from the Girard estate in Philadelphia, from heavy investment from New York capitals, capitalists, and the region becomes, by the end of the 19th century, a colony, really, that's split kind of in two. The southernmost region is heavily oriented toward Philadelphia, and it's Philadelphia money that controls it. And the area angling more toward New York is controlled by New York, and it's New York money that's controlling it. In fact, the leading figure for understanding the coal region in 1900 is J. Pierpont Morgan, who owned and consolidated all the railroads of the region, and the railroads in turn owned most of the mines. So much of the area by 1900 is a colony of either New York or Philadelphia.
It's really a classic story of American capitalism. Starting out with individual entrepreneurs, family operations, and gradually being taken over by capital that comes in from the outside, and finally, as Don said, dominated by the huge trusts at the end of the century. So it's a story of American capitalism, really, in one small corner of Pennsylvania.
Don Miller, you mentioned the railroads, and you also write about the canals. Can you explain how that whole system worked? I mean, once they found it, the coal, how they got it to market?
Well, the rivers that run through the region are very shallow, and you can mine the coal and put them on what they call coal arcs, but it's very difficult to get these coal arcs down to a place like Bristol, which is the port, north of Philadelphia that was used to store the coal. So they would build these huge wing dams across the river, like to dam up the river, and then they'd line these boats up like so many little toy boats, and they'd break the dam apart, and these coal boats would go flying down to Philadelphia, 135 miles down, and about 90% of them were in wreck and ruin by the time they got to Philadelphia, but some got through. And then they finally decided on the idea, when they had more capital, of developing a canal system. So the canals were the arteries that took the water highways that brought the coal to major markets like New York and Philadelphia. And canals were built. The Morris Canal, for example, was built straight across to the Hudson River eventually, and fed New York.
From where? Where does it start?
That starts out near Scranton and west of Scranton, and actually jumps the river over there. John Roebling built
the bridge.
Who built the Brooklyn
First
Bridge,
iron bridge.
built the viaduct that took the canal boats across
Started
there.
at Honesdale.
So the canal boats literally sail over a bridge, and at Honesdale and across to New York, and in the Perth Amboy and places like that. And the Delaware Canal, of course, and the Lehigh Canals run straight down past Easton and down to Philadelphia.
The canals were the anthracite canals were the first comprehensive inland transportation system in North America. They were, in a sense, they were the interstates of the early 19th century.
Who owned them?
Some of them were privately owned. The Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company, for example, owned the Lehigh Canal, which ran from up above Jim Thorpe, used to be called Mock Chunk, down to Easton. But the Delaware Canal that ran from Easton down to Bristol was state-owned. So it was a mix. There were state constructed and state-owned canals.
Yeah, a lot of government money went into those canals, and they called them internal improvements. And then no sooner the canals built, and they're knocked right out of the box by their leading competitors, the railroads. And they built the railroad beds right along the canal beds. And so the two were in competition for a while. But, of course, the railroad runs year-round. A canal freezes up for 4 to 5 months of the year, and a railroad can carry much more coal than a canal and carry it more cheaply. So the competition was stacked in favor of the railroad from the beginning, and then they become, right up until the end of the coal boom, the chief means of carrying that coal out of the region. Transportation's the key, really.
Yeah, the railroads got their start in the 1840s. The Reading was really one of the first and most innovative companies. It ran from Philadelphia up to Pottsville. And the feeder lines were then developed from the mining areas down to the first to the canals and then to the railroad terminals. And so Reading became a kind of prototype of how to develop an industrial corporation. The anthracite railroads, in fact, became models then for the railroads that were developed throughout the rest of the United States. It took a different kind of organization because of the space and the factors in the railroads. They were scattered out over large areas of territory, and it was then necessary to reorganize how one did business and how to control these things. And so the anthracite railroads then became models of railroad development for the country as a whole.
My relatives came into the region like that, building the railroads. That's a lot. The Irish from Boston and New York would come and dig the railroad beds, lay the track, and many stayed. So, you know, immigration starts, you know, in that fashion in the region.
I want to show this picture, which you have in your book, which is the Stourbridge Lion.
The first locomotive in North America.
And you credit it with having the first train trip in.
First train trip. That's
North
correct.
Right.
Right.
Did it have any productive life?
No, never worked properly. One of the problems.
That's good.
Yeah, I'm sure it was probably more dangerous to the fireman and the engineer than.
Where is it now?
Else. I think the original was destroyed. There's a model, I believe. I'm not sure where it is. Somewhere there's a model of this original Stourbridge line. I know there's some early models in a museum that the former Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad has in Baltimore. It's a railroad museum, and there are some similar to that.
Is there a place people can go and see some remnants of the canals?
Oh yeah, Easton, you know, the Easton Canal Museum has a new headquarters in downtown Easton. They have a beautifully reconstructed. It's a brand new museum. It's not reconstructed, and you get a wonderful sense of the Pennsylvania canals. They have a beautiful lit up map, and you press the map, and one canal appears. Press another, and then the lights for another canal appear. They have old canal boats, and you can actually take a ride on the canal boat. It runs about what, a mile and a half.
A mile and a half, and during the warm months. Yeah.
Canals are the boats were pulled by mules, and so you can go for a ride there. And there's places all over the state where you can go into active mines. There's a mine up in Scranton that's a tourist attraction, as it were. And there's also a mine in the western part of the anthracite region. That's
Ashland.
The one in Ashland. That's the one that Bill Wine had actually started and ran for years. So that gives you, we always take our students there because it gives you a great sense of, you know, how coal is taken from the earth, you know, how it's shipped, and things like that. So we're lucky in that regard that we have those artifacts. It's kind of like teaching Civil War history and having available the battlefield at Gettysburg. Yeah.
Well, will you describe how they would take coal out of the ground? I mean, if they go to a place and say, okay, we know coal is under here, how do they decide how to get it out?
Well, they have borings into the ground, first of all. That's you know, no pun intended, that's the most boring part of it. But then you dig down in there, and there's all kinds of ways to get underground. Let's talk about an elevator shaft. It's a straight elevator shaft, right down a vertical underground railroad that takes you deep into the earth. These were the deepest of the mines. And when you reach the bottom, they started to dig out huge tunnels. And then they had to dig out airways. So you have to have air circulating down there. And huge bull fans would move the air underground. Dust and coal dust would build up down there. And don't forget, a lot of these early miners, for illumination, they have lamps that are just flames. Okay, they're not enclosed lights, you know. And this is before the Edison incandescent lamp. And one of those lamps hits that coal dust, and poof, they were losing 3 men every 2 days early in the anthracite industry, in these small accidents where they'd go in, they'd find pockets of coal, which would also be pockets of gas. So a lot of miners met their doom like that. And then you set the whole thing up like that, and you have a constant water problem as well. There's a lot of seepage down there, so you have pumps moving all the time, moving the water out. And then the coal is mined in this fashion. It's sloped like this. It's not flat. You can't use machinery in there. It's impervious to machinery. So these guys have to crawl up into these holes. No higher, say, than a coffin. And some of them even wore knee pads and elbow pads to get up in there. And then you'd stick you'd use some sort of boring device to dig a hole into the wall of the mine and you stuck powder in there. You ran a fuse out. We hid behind some rocks or around the corner. You lit the fuse, and you just hope that the flame gets to the dynamite, the powder. Because if it goes out, then the question becomes, do I go out and get that? And it might just be a slow fuse. So a lot of guys were just blown to smithereens like that. And then when the coal's blown off the face, as it's called, the miners simply pick it up and they put it into large carts, which are pulled by mules originally, and later electrical engines. And they're taken out of the mines.
What made anthracite mining unique, I think, is the fact that it was really a cottage industry. Because of the nature of the coal seams in the anthracite region, it required handcrafting, handwork, piecework literally. And so each miner had to be a multifaceted worker, had to be a carpenter, had to be a mason, had to know something about powder and explosives, had to be able to detect gases in the mines, as Don pointed out. This created something we call the miner's freedom. It created a kind of independence of attitude among anthracite miners. They were very strong individualists. They were among industrial workers. Miners were unique in that respect. They did not brook much direction by foremen, and we point out in the book that trying to supervise miners underground over a vast area on an individual basis was extremely difficult because of the craft nature of their work. They worked literally alone. They would have a helper, maybe two helpers, but they would work, you're talking about working hundreds of feet, sometimes 1,000 feet or more underground in absolute darkness, in silence, with the constant fear that the roof is going to come down on you, fear of gases, and they worked in these conditions. And so it created I think a sort of unique individual, a very strong, self-reliant, independent-minded worker. And this contributed, I think, then to the kind of culture that existed above ground, too.
What was that culture?
It was a culture that was, first of all, it was unique, I think, in the sense that it was made up of many ethnic groups, of many different kinds of people. These groups were frequently divided among themselves. When the Irish came, they found the English dominated the coal region just as the English dominated Ireland, the place they just left. Then when the Eastern and Southern Europeans came after the Civil War, they found that the English-speaking people dominated them. But the work itself contributed to make, I think, these miners having those characteristics I just mentioned, the independence, the self-reliance, this ability to stand up for themselves that many other industrial workers didn't have.
Were there miners who enjoyed being miners?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hard work. It's very dangerous work, but these guys took tremendous pride in their work.
I would say pride in something.
Yeah.
And all the miners we talked to, old miners, show this tremendous pride in what they've done.
Kind of gets in their blood too, and they're proud of it. And they don't think of themselves, as Dick says, as industrial workers, like steel workers. We're different from steel workers, We don't have foremen. We're different from auto workers. We don't have assembly lines. We're on our own in there. But at the same time that they're on their own, they have this bond among themselves. Guy gets hurt, there's an explosion underground, a rescue crew has to go in there. There's no lack of volunteers. So they have this kind of communal sense that arises from the work experience. And that starts to break down the ethnic differences. Working together in common underground. As John Mitchell, who was an early mine organizer, used to constantly point out, it's not Irish coal you're mining, it's not Slavic coal you're mining, it's coal. And you've got to start to think in common. And when that begins to occur around the start of the 20th century, miners are able to sustain major strikes, hold on through the strike, keep down the ethnic discord, and win some of the bigger anthracite strikes in the early 20th century.
They started young. working in the mines?
They started at about average age, I guess, was about 9. They would start in the breakers. These were the big factories where the coal was cleaned and sorted before it was put in the coal cars. They go into the work in the breakers under conditions that were today would be considered inhuman, and then graduated at around age 12 into other jobs, usually on the surface. They would take care of the mules. They would work as in the shoveling coal into the steam engines, which ran the hoists and the other machinery for the mines. And then they would go underground and work as door boys, opening and closing the doors, which controlled the flow of air in and out of the mines. And eventually they would become miners' helpers. And of course, the last stage, usually when they were in their 20s, was to become a certified miner. And by the late 19th century, you had to become a certified miner, you had to pass a state examination in English. And I say in English because learning enough English to get miner certification was a major problem for many of the immigrants.
What kind of questions do you have to answer?
Basically questions about procedures in the mines, questions concerning safety, for example. The state of Pennsylvania was beginning to pass legislation at the end of the 19th century concerning mine safety. And although many times it was ignored by the coal companies, still it became important, at least to the miners.
What kind of powder to use, how much powder to use, things like that. These kids, too, they were tough. I mean, they were chewing tobacco at 7 and 8. You know, their vocabulary would embarrass their teachers. I mean, they were tough kids. And there's a funny thing. Lewis Hine is a very famous American documentary photographer, and probably the most famous. And some of his most haunting pictures are of these breaker boys. But when we examine the pictures, when you look at the pictures, he has his notes on the back, you know, and he writes about the extraordinary exploitation. How could these children be working under these kinds of conditions? But then you get into the records and you find that their parents want them there and they want to be there. Reason being that everyone had to work to support the family. So a 9-year-old kid that's going to school is a liability in the family financially. That kid has to go to school, and he doesn't think of himself as a man until he gets out of school at the age of 9 or 10.
The state legislature of Pennsylvania actually passed legislation ruling that children could not be employed in the mines underground, for example, until they were 16. Parents themselves falsified documents so that the children could actually go to work in the mines earlier. Yeah. But this was usually done, as Don mentioned, for economic reasons. For reasons of economic welfare of the family.
How well did it pay?
Well, you got paid not by the hour. You got paid by the amount of coal that you mined. And coal was a boom and bust industry. So it's hard, it would be hard to discern exactly how much a coal miner made in a given year. In a good year, a coal miner could make a decent wage, equivalent to that of a steel worker. At that time, about $620 or $630, you know, which is about $16,000 or $17,000 today.
Around the turn of the century. Again, these figures vary according to time and place. But around the turn of the century, a breaker boy made about 60 cents a day. They worked, if the mines were working full blast, they would work 6 days a week, usually up to 10 to 12 hours a day. And these were children. These were not the miners themselves.
The problem was life was short because your emphysema was the big killer. I mean, you're constantly breathing the coal dust. I mean, you're breathing coal dust in those coal breakers. That's where you got most of the coal dust. And that whole breaker would shake, you know, as that coal came down through there. And these kids are picking it out by hand. They're trying to pick the slate and the rock from the coal. And so that only pure coal runs through there. And the coal would come shooting down there. And you can imagine the racket, the noise, the smoke, the soot. They'd all wear bandanas on their faces and things like that.
Now, let me interrupt for just a second. This is a picture of a breaker
Yeah.
you have on here. And if you drive up through the anthracite region, you can still see
Yes,
some of these
there
around.
are still some
Yeah.
left, yes.
What happens inside there?
Okay, the coal is taken, in this case, the coal is taken to the top, and it's dumped from rail cars, from the mine cars. It's brought out of the mine, it's taken on railroad tracks up to the top of the breaker. There it's dumped into large cylindrical drums where it is crushed and then it begins to fall down through screens, and the screens sort the coal according to different sizes, from very small to large, and it's washed, and these sorting screens are on this downward slope as the coal moves down by gravity, and on these pulleys through the down to the coal cars at the very bottom. These are railroad cars at the bottom. And the breaker boys, or the slate pickers, as they were called, would sit either in or along the chutes and pull out the impurities as they went by, the slate, for example.
How much coal would a miner mine in a day?
It depended again on circumstances. If he had a good seam, and if he could get to the face, in other words, where the coal was located, the seam was located, fairly quickly, and there wasn't much problem in terms of gas. He didn't have to clear gas. He didn't have to wait for cars, and he had good powder. Everything worked. He could probably extract up to 10, 12 tons in a day. But that was, I suppose, in the most favorable circumstances.
What does that translate into in terms of use? I mean, how many households?
Oh my!
How much would a household use?
I don't know. Well, I'll tell you, from growing up, we used to have to cart. I used to always have to go down to the cellar to bring the coal up for the coal stove in the kitchen, and I always took a bucket in the morning, and there'd be another, usually about 3.5 buckets a day. These buckets were, I guess they would hold maybe. I really can't say. I guess they would hold maybe 20, 25 pounds of coal. So you're going to have to do something from there.
I have to do that math after the program.
We used to, when we bought coal by the ton, of course.
Yes, you bought it by the ton.
You bought it by the ton. We'd probably get on an average winter, I think, probably 4 or 5 tons, I guess. Of course, now we're in a cold part of the state. So that's as good as I can tell you. Yeah.
When did people first start talking about unions?
Well, almost from the beginning. But the problem was when the Irish arrived and the Welsh arrived. But these early unions are easily crushed, again, because of the extreme ethnic divisions. I mean, the Irish land here in Pennsylvania. They come in through New York and Boston, but when they arrive here in Pennsylvania, they must have said, "Oh my God, here's the English," you know, and tremendous feuding and incendiarism and terrorism and killing that all surrounded the famous Molly Maguire riots. I mean, they're trying to organize a union then, but it's very difficult because they're battling one of the most powerful industrial combinations in the country, the Philadelphia and Pennsylvania railroads. And railroads are the first and most powerful American corporations. And so by the 1880s, unionism, which had a promising start right after the Civil War, the union movement is moribund. And then it picks up again with really dramatic force at the end of the 19th century when John Mitchell and the United Mine Workers, a large national union that organized every aspect of the industry. And it was primarily an organization made up of bituminous miners, but Mitchell brought his organizers into the anthracite region. And beginning in the middle of the 1890s and right in through the early 1900s, they made a sustained, hard push to organize these workers, and were successful in the end. After a gigantic strike in 1902 under the administration of Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt is the first president to intervene in a labor dispute in the history of the country on the side of the workers. And he sets up a board of arbitration, and that included people like the key person is Clarence Darrow, the representative of the miners, and the arbitration board rules on behalf of the miners. And shortly thereafter, the mine union is recognized by the owners. Morgan was in there too, because Morgan wanted
the J.P. Morgan.
J.P. Morgan. He wanted order, orderly economic development, an orderly utilization of raw materials like coal, and he didn't like the wildcat strikes that broke out in the region. He didn't like the constant bickering and the fierce competition among the small company owners, like people like the Pardees, the Van Wickles, and the Markles. Those names are familiar to Richard and I because they founded Lafayette College. We walk around and see all their buildings. They were the smaller mine owners. So Morgan brings a measure of order to the industry and actually accepts the fact of the labor union. And there was a modicum of peace that lasted into the 1930s. There would always be strikes, but it settles down dramatically. The ethnic tension settles down, and the friction between management and labor is not as ferocious as it was in kind of the buccaneering stage in the 19th century when the industry's really getting going.
Yeah, we really have to also talk about the Molly Maguires.
I wanted to ask you about that. I want to ask each of you, because different people have different opinions on this.
Yeah.
Are they a precursor to the unions, or are they a band of murderous thugs?
Franklin Benjamin Gowan, the president of the Reading Railroad, who brought the Mollies to trial and really destroyed the organization. I don't believe there was such an organization, either does Don. But in any case, it was what Gowan was trying to do was to root out unionism in the coal fields, and that was in the 1870s. But as early as the Civil War, and even before that, there were various associations, working men's associations, that attempted to early unionization. But as Don pointed out, these were largely unsuccessful. The Mollies, it's still an issue in the region. You can, depending on what side your ancestors were on, they'll tell you whether they were great working class heroes, or whether they were, ruthless terrorists who got what they deserved. We never found an organization called the Molly Maguires, and I don't know, and to our knowledge, no other historian has either. What they were sort of informal groups within the ancient order of Hibernians, which was the fraternal organization of the Irish here in North America. And there were sort of informal groupings of these people who, in the interest of not only the Irish, but in the interest of working men who felt that they were being exploited by individual foremen or superintendents, would carry out these terrorist acts, going as far as murder, for example, everything from murder to sabotage, what have you. So at least as far as I'm concerned, the Mollies did not exist as an organization, but they were certainly, there were terrorist, loosely organized terrorist groups within this Irish organization. So at least that's my fix on the Mollies.
It's a wild, crazy time, too. The Mollies, if they existed, begin to show their presence in the 1860s, of course, in the middle of the Civil War. And what they're protesting is Lincoln's policy of the draft, conscription. It's the first conscription law ever passed in American history. They don't want to fight a war for the Union Army that's going to free black people and have those black people come north and take their jobs. That's the great fear. So there's tremendous anti-draft riots, much as occurred in New York City in 1863 in the anthracite region. And in the process, there, at the same time, there is vigilante action and terrorist action against coal owners who happen to be Welsh and English. But I think the key thing was you create in the public mind the idea that there is this Irish terrorist organization and that they're connected to the major labor union that the Irish were trying to organize at this time. They're two separate things. And what Gowan was successful in doing, he and the Pennsylvania Railroad, is they paint the Mollies, they paint the Union with the brush of the Molly Maguires. And so the Union, which is absolutely separate from the Molly Maguires, becomes tainted by Molly Maguireism, and it becomes easy to crush that Union. So it was a very convenient device, I think.
You say at the start of one of your chapters, your chapter on the Molly Maguires, on the east wall of cell 17 of the Carbon County Jail in
Yes.
Mock-Chunk, there is a faint outline of a human handprint. It is visible despite numerous repaintings and an attempt by a jailer to chip it out many years ago. According to legend, it was placed there by Alexander Campbell, who declared angrily, "That mark of mine will never be wiped out. There it will remain forever to shame the county that is hanging an innocent man." On the morning when he supposedly put his mark on the cell wall, Campbell died on the gallows with Michael Doyle, John Yellowjack Donahue, and Edward Kelly. Is that a true story?
You gotta believe.
there?
You gotta
Believe it, yes.
Have you seen it?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
What's
I
it
don't
look
know
like?
what
Well, now the Mock-Chunk Jail, or the Jim Thorpe Jail, is now a tourist attraction, right? The whole town has become a tourist attraction. But I understand there are tours through that old jail. I don't know if you've ever
You can see
seen
the
it.
handprint.
can
Yeah, I've
see
been
it.
in.
But
I've
there's a
been in,
faint
yeah.
outline there.
There's
you
a
can
faint
see it.
outline.
But
who knows?
Who knows? It's a great story in any case. And,
Certainly not central to the whole story of this book, but yeah, and believed by many.
yeah. But the idea is that these guys are all Irish, and of course the Irish as a people at this particular time were at the bottom of the social ladder in the anthracite region. So.
And they've just arrived. They're carrying with them the traditions of Irish resistance. I mean, this is how the Irish resisted the British landlords, through informal gangs like this called the White Boys or the Molly Maguires or whatever you want to call them. And one group would appear and then disappear. Who were the White Boys? Well, they were crushed, but then they reassemble somewhere else and call themselves something different. So this is how they fought. They came here, unlike later immigrants, with a tradition of hostility toward, let's put it this way, with a willingness to take concerted, organized action against people who exploited them because they were used to doing that. And that's why you have so much violence in the region. That didn't happen with Slavic immigrants. It didn't happen with Irish immigrants who didn't have that same concerted vigilante action occurring against landlords and powerful political interest in the old country. But the Irish did. They had been fighting back for 300 years in Ireland.
When did the industry start to decline?
Really after the First World War in the 1920s. And there were a number of reasons, chiefly the beginning use of oil and gas, natural gas, as heating oil and as cooking oil, and also in industrial uses. And so this marked the beginning of the decline. The Great Depression of the 1930s occurred in the coal region of Pennsylvania, in the anthracite region, about a decade earlier. And so, but there were also, as a result of the decline, there were also many strikes as well, as miners were attempting to, through the United Mine Workers, to defend their interests, to defend their position. And I suspect too that that these labor strikes in the 1920s contributed as well. In some cases, for example, consumers of anthracite simply switched to other fuels because of the strikes and the shortages. So. It was in the 1920s, and there was a brief uptick during World War II, but after that it was pretty much gone.
How much anthracite mining is going on right now?
Not a lot, more than there was probably 15 years ago. There's some active mining in the Pottsville area. They're using a lot of coal refuse. They have coal conversion plants in Mount Carmel, right?
Yeah,
around Mount Carmel. So there's not a lot of activity, but there's an awful lot of coal up there. And a lot of energy people that we were meeting in Washington years ago are claiming that, as we move toward the next energy age, what is it going to be? We go through water and wood and then oil and gas and coal, and what's next? Is it going to be the underwater? Is it going to be solar, nuclear? Well, nuclear seems to be out of the box now. One of the prevailing arguments was that there's enough anthracite available to act as a kind of a bridge fuel if the country ever did get into
there's
some energy
still
trouble.
more anthracite in the ground than has been mined.
Right.
And when we finished the book, I think at that time, in the mid-1980s, about 6 million tons a year were being mined. And most of that, of course, through stripping methods. In other words, the overburden of the earth was stripped away.
What's it being used for now?
It is being used in various industrial uses, and there's some use in residences too, as a home heating oil. I suspect that eventually it will, in some fashion, make a comeback. Perhaps not the way it did before, not the way it was before, but certainly I think it has its potentials.
Well, I said at the start of this program that we would probably be able to do an hour on each chapter of the book, and unfortunately we're out of time. We barely scratched the surface, but this is the cover of the book we've been talking about, The Kingdom of Coal. Donald Miller and Richard Sharpless, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details. Like us on Facebook.